Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of our 2024 GradLab series. I'm Joseph Greene, chair of the Graduate Student Activities Subcommittee and host for this episode. I'm thrilled to announce that this year's GradLab theme is entitled Get Funded, Get Published, a Grad's Guide to Scientific Communication, which is aimed to bring you 4 episodes to help demystify how to interpret your research successes, communicate those results for different audiences, go through the publishing cycle, maximize your conference experience, and demystify the grant writing process. Today, I am joined by our guest, Sean Bentley, the 2024 IEEE-HKN President-Elect and Associate Professor of Physics at Adelphi University, who will help us dive into today's topic and answer the ever-important question, how do I know when my results are significant? For this episode, Sean and I will spend the first 40 or so minutes holding a moderated discussion, followed by a Q&A session with our live audience. I ask that all participants please keep their videos and audios off until the Q&A session begins. With that aside, let's get started with today's discussion. Welcome, Sean. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, fantastic to get the chance to learn a little bit more about your experiences as well as dive into this important topic. To get started, I understand you prepared a little bit of a research to tell us about your background and teaching experience. Did you want to kick off with pulling up that slide?
Oh, sure. Let me have it here. So, oops, let me just. Sorry for the delay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Here we go. So yeah, so trying to get it to go into. I think I went past it now, didn't I?
No
Okay,
problem.
there we go. Back. All right. So again, I started out. I grew up in Missouri, and so I went to what at the time was University of Missouri-Rolla. It's now Missouri S&T. Has been now for several years, and again, and this is part of what will come up as we get into the discussion, is how do you even get into research? How do you decide what you want to research? And for me, it actually started out, I was taking a class with a professor who I just really enjoyed the professor's, the way they presented material. And I had no idea what he actually researched at the time. So I went and talked to him, and he did optics. And so some of it sounded pretty interesting. So I started doing Fourier optics. In fact, I just come out of, like one of the typical classes we all take where you learn all about signals and systems. And in fact, that was the class I'd had him for. And so Fourier to this day is one of my favorite things. And so got in there, and actually we were looking at the application for this that we were looking at the time was like when jets would fly. It's easy, easy in a sense using Doppler effect or whatever to get longitudinal speeds, but transverse speeds can be a trickier thing to achieve. And so we were actually looking at shining a laser beam, getting speckle patterns, and trying to do real-time analysis of speed of quite distant objects and things that could be for tracking, whatever on that. So that's where I started out as an undergrad and really got fascinated with the whole research process at that time. And along the way, so I was inducted into HKN as an undergrad and served as chapter president. After I finished my degree there, I stayed on there to do my master's and switched over and did stay still in optics, but I looked at a magnetic field sensor, an optically based magnetic field sensor, and did that. And then I decided to jump, completely into optics, went off and did my PhD in that, and went to the University of Rochester. And I'd started out looking primarily at nonlinear optics, and I did several things with nonlinear thermometers and gases, nonlinear pattern formation liquids. But the thing that really drew my interest towards the end of my PhD was the idea of quantum entanglement and quantum information. And so we actually did, to some extent, the first implementation of EPR in the way EPR described it back in the 1935 paper. And then we did several things in quantum imaging, got some very foundational work. One of the papers, and if we have time later, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but because, the whole thing here is what should you publish, what shouldn't you? I didn't think we should write this paper at the time. And it's to this day, not only my most referenced paper, I think it may still be my advisor's most referenced paper. And I mean, he's had an extreme career over the years. So like I say, here over 1,250 times that's been cited to date. And so then I went off and became a physics professor at Adelphi. I've been there since 2003. And so I've got my own quantum and optics lab. And now we're a purely undergraduate department. And so I've had the pleasure of mentoring over 50 undergraduate students in these last, 21 years now. I did take a couple of years to go serve as director of Society of Physics students in Sigma Pi Sigma, which is the Physics Honor Society, just to get, again, more of that direct connection with the students out there and see the bigger impact. I've, for a long time, been trying to finish up a text I'm writing on quantum imaging. It's just kind of seems like I spend a few minutes here and there when I get to it, and hopefully I will eventually publish it before I retire. Um, and then this summer, we're starting a quantum engineering course that I'm teaching here, and ultimately looking to create a quantum engineering track. Because again, part of my research over the years is the whole thing going from EE through optics and quantum and through physics is that these worlds have a lot of overlap. And again, some of our audience may be from a variety of different majors and fields, and even within EE, there tends to be, a broad, spread of fields. But the quantum side of things has continually becoming more applied. And, many of the audiences, I'm sure, heard of quantum cryptography, quantum computing, all these sorts of things. And so that's kind of the step, is just really trying to show that these things really do have application now, and trying to get more people to experience it. And I think especially for students in engineering, if they're really thinking, what different thing could I do? That's an area now that might as well get in before, you're too late to jump on that. So that's just a quick thing about my background there. But let me just stop sharing this.
Yeah, no, thanks for taking a moment to share. And while a little bit off topic, I think there's a really, really good lesson in there, which is amazing just how far a little bit of fundamentals can take you. Like if you have some solid differential equations and probability theory, all of a sudden you can engage in really any major field across EE. And I took a pretty similar sort of journey. I started with a big Fourier optics background, recently been going into computational imaging and deep learning with some extrapolated work on nonlinear optics. And it's amazing how the same math just keeps coming back and back and back and back. And I think it's really good to have someone with your breadth of experiences, especially as we dive into this conversation. I think as a good first question, a lot of our viewers of grad labs are relatively new graduate students. So let's say they're in the same situation as you. You took a undergraduate research in one field, now you're starting a graduate research in a different, let's say, tangential field. So before we can start discussing when our results are significant, we should first start discussing how do we actually design a research problem to get significant results. So when engaging with a new field, how can we go about engaging and learning from that field to learn what sort of research we can do to get significant impact?
Yeah. And again, one thing I'll point out right from the start is there are no absolute right and wrong answers to these things. It really is a journey and a process. And so try to learn from everyone you can. In fact, the big thing about academia, now industry is different, and there could be a lot of great inputs that people from industry would give on this as well, but their goal is very different. So really, I think the goal of academia is kind of twofold. One is to create new knowledge, and the other is to train the next generation of people. And the great thing about student research is it's addressing both at once, right? And so you're both generating that knowledge, but you're also being trained while you're doing it. And so that's the thing, when you're starting out in research, you're not expected to be an expert, because that's the whole thing. You're learning how to do it. And so there's two things, and it's kind of this tricky line of which way to go. One is reading, right? And so looking at what others have done. That's always a critical thing for a lot of reasons. One is it just kind of, it builds your background and knowledge of the field so you're better prepared for it, but also it kind of shows you what has been done, right? Because sometimes you have this idea, you think, oh, this would be so great to do, after a lit search, and you find out lit searches are a little more tricky than, a typical Google search. And even with Google searches, sometimes you're looking for something. The trouble often is really you come up with too many results, right? It's not too few for most things. It's the same thing. And so figuring out which keywords to use, what, choices of things there, and what search to do. But you'll sometimes think, oh, this is the best idea on earth. Maybe somebody did it 10 years ago, 20 years, 50 years ago. Sometimes you'll find out. So it's, but every once in a while you find out no one has done it. And that's the big thing, right? So you first have to make sure that what you're thinking is at least a little bit novel. Again, it doesn't have to be groundbreaking, like, whatever, but at least needs to be some sort of a level of improvement on what's been done. So it's good to know what's been done. But the other is also just jumping in, and for most of I think most people would be looking at this are primarily either in something that's computational or experimental or something like that. We may have some theorists here as well, and that's great. That's not my background, and so I can't speak as well to theoretical research. But for most of us, getting our hands on it, whether it's just on a computer, if you're doing something as computational programming, simulation, or actually for me, it's primarily in the laboratory, actually building something, setting something up, making some measurements, because it really gives you exposure to how that sort of system works, and really some real world challenges, right? Because you may think, oh, in fact, you know, one of my PhD advisor, it was like a running joke in our lab group. Whenever we'd have a discussion about something, he'd say, "Oh yeah, that's an afternoon experiment." Well, of course, the reality is, once you spent months and months and months trying to set something up and dealing with all the problems, yeah, in the end, you get your data in an afternoon. But it takes a long time. There's so many challenges, and so yeah, so really just seeing what has been done, what you can do, what your ideas are, and is it really feasible experimentally or computationally or whatever. And so trying to kind of lay out those sorts of things, because as you go through and kind of, I guess one thing I just kind of say universally, at least in this, some people disagree with this again, but is I think sometimes it's just good to kind of take yourself down a road. Even if that road doesn't lead where you thought it was going to lead, it will very likely lead you someplace good. I've had so many results come out of things when it wasn't even what I was looking for, quite honestly. There's the whole, I think way too often in middle school, we're taught the whole, the scientific procedure, whatever they call it, the scientific method, right? And so you formulate the hypothesis, do this, do this. Yes, in principle, the ideas of that are nice, but from my experience and talking to a lot of other researchers, I don't think for most of us that's exactly how we do it. It's more of we have kind of this idea that's in our mind of what we want to try to do or what we're trying to try and improve or whatever. And so looking to make sure it hasn't already been done, then thinking through, is it kind of feasible? And then just going in and seeing what we can actually achieve. Do we have the materials? Because that's the thing too. And this is part of what separates sometimes physics from engineering. But quite honestly, as a physicist who has to pay for it, you still have to worry about it, is what's it cost, right? And is it feasible with the materials, the cost and so forth? How big of a project is this going to be and so forth? So there's those sorts of things you have to think about when you're starting. And so, like I say, the two biggest, just to summarize that, the two biggest things I'd say is read a lot, but also jump in and do. And so trying to do them a little bit simultaneously, I think can be good. And also, you know, even no matter how much you love the field, I sometimes think just reading gets boring for a while. So I love to just go in the lab and just start doing some things as well.
And I think that's a really good lesson. I'm currently a fifth year, so towards the end of my program, and I've gotten the opportunity to mentor some first years as they come in. And one of the aspects I encourage is, yeah, start at those fundamentals and don't just accept it, prove it for yourself. So as a Fourier optics guy, you'll appreciate it. A lens is a Fourier transform. You can go through the painful amount of math it takes to prove that, but I think it's so much fun to take that lesson and then, well, let's prove it computationally and get a simulation for what the far field pattern looks like. Now let's go into the lab and actually showcase that this is the phenomenon. And I definitely agree with you that doing a lot of reading, not just to understand the state of the art, but build a broad foundation and generalize your skills will only set you up for success.
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely. And just there's one follow-up to that. And I don't necessarily suggest this level to an undergrad if there's undergrads watching this, but certainly when you're a grad student, make dedicated time for this. So every day, when I was a grad student, and for me it was the Los Alamos Archives quantum section for a big
yeah,
chunk of it. But whatever it is, I would dedicate like the first an hour to 2 hours of my day to where I go through and see what was new on there, read every single title. From that, then read some abstracts, and then from that, pick out the papers I thought were the most relevant and go through them. So just make it part of your activity, like anything else you're going to do in your day. Set aside a time for the reading, because, like I say, it just keeps you constant. It keeps you thinking. It'll generate. Quite honestly, once you get it starts generating a lot of ideas in your mind too, right? You're like, wait a second, they did that. I don't necessarily think that's what I want to do, but what if we did this instead, right? Because and so it really that's the whole thing with conference, everything else, is it's yes, it's partially about spreading knowledge, but it's also spreading knowledge triggers new knowledge, right? And so I think it's a thing. It's almost like an avalanche sort of effect. So it really is a good thing to go down.
for sure. And I think one thing that's helped me a lot in terms of getting started and keeping up with the field, which is a little bit of an irrelevant question, but equally important as a graduate student, is honestly Google Scholar alerts.
Yeah.
Once I felt like I had a broad enough foundation to understand the current state of research, I picked the 5 professors that I respected the most, both in and out of my field, and just signed up for their alerts so I could keep track of how they're thinking about and engaging with science. Because as you mentioned, being a grad student, this is a training opportunity. We need to learn how to conduct research. And the best way to do that is to go out there and see who's conducting research well and to some degree imitate their thought processes.
Absolutely.
So speaking of that, I think one of the hardest challenges I encountered as a young graduate student is learning how to come up with decent hypotheses. How can I take a look at the foundations of the field, the state of the art, and then say, maybe if I apply X, I'll be able to push this by Y%. So just from a fundamental perspective, and especially in pertinence to academic research, what really makes a good hypothesis from a bad hypothesis, and what key aspects like quantitative metrics should we keep in mind when coming up with our hypotheses?
Well, and that's, definitely a great question. And it really does become a little bit field specific, because in some fields, a 5% increase is like huge, right? In others, if you're not talking order of magnitude, because one thing also when we're looking at this whole thing is it's that what we sometimes refer to as the obvious extension. And so, because anything can be considered kind of new, right? If you do it with just a different material, a different this, a different that. Um, but was it something that should have been to the normal audience of that paper an obvious extension was already been done, or something that's just minor? And so, how good is good enough to be? And again, the whole thing about significance, we'll get into. It's not well defined, right? It's not like statistical significance where you're like, you can actually do some calculation, say, oh, this is now significant, and this is something that we can say is a 5 sigma or whatever sort of a thing. But certainly you have to look at, does it, does it actually make sense, like mathematically? Because 99.9% of things we're doing, there's some approximations coming into play, some whatever. We're making some assumptions. So look at those assumptions and do they seem valid? And then realistically, try to determine, like say, and this, like say, I think it's the hardest part, and you do have to kind of look at the field, is the metric for how much of an improvement is really needed to be a meaningful improvement. And like say in some fields it's pretty small. So like, with things, for example, and it's, I think it's still probably happening this way a little bit, but I used to look more at lithography. I haven't followed it so much lately, but just a few percent better in one dimension, which when you start looking at areas, you start packing things in, they were looking for anything to stretch that, right? Whereas in other fields, you needed a bigger step. And so, but it still needs to be something that you can lay down and say, this is the target goal. Maybe you're not going to reach it, but it's well defined. You've got a plan to get there, and you have basically a statement that shows it is different from, in some way, from what's been done before. If it doesn't kind of meet those things, so you can't clearly define it, you can't show that it's somewhat likely feasible, and it's not different from what's done before, it's at least not meaningful research hypothesis. For an undergraduate project, like if you're doing a class project or even sometimes a grad project, it doesn't have to necessarily be new all the time, right? But if you're doing research, to some extent, something about it needs to be new. And so that's one of the big indicators. But how new is new? Really, like I say, that's always one of the big questions is, if you make something that's 5% faster, 5%, smaller, whatever, is that good enough of a metric? And that's where, looking at that field can be really useful. So leaning on the mentor a little bit, and that's the thing, is we haven't talked about this at all yet, other than just in passing on some of the experiences, but the mentor is important, especially when you're starting out. They have to give you some guidance on this. Look at the papers and see what's been published and things like that. What sort of increments and improvements have people done before on whatever the things are? Again, if you come up with something that sounds entirely new, obviously that's great. But the reality is most of what we do tends to be smaller incremental improvements over past things than these groundbreaking Nobel Prize winning sort of, level advancements. So, and if you get those are great. And usually there's less question than if it's good enough. But 99% of the time, we're looking at taking what has been done and making it better. And
For sure.
just finding that benchmark there. And that, like I say, that's always the tricky thing to define, is how good that benchmark is. But it's usually, like I say, something that you could look at it as it would have a meaningful impact in some way. And it's also not an obvious, trivial extension to what's already been done.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a couple of good points in there. I think one of them, just to summarize a little bit, is as scientists would say, and especially as engineers and physicists, we get very caught up in the how a lot. Like, oh, I'm going to optimize a meta surface and put it in front of this optical element to encode the wavefront, but that's already too far when it comes to a hypothesis. Really, what matters most up front is the what are you doing and why is it significant? Why does it hold potential and promise to actually revolutionize or even push incrementally the problem that you're trying to address? And then I think, as you mentioned before, one of the greatest tools as a new student is okay, yeah, bleed in as many assumptions as you need and show it in simulation, show it in a toy example on the tabletop, show that yes, this is in fact feasible. And that's a great start that you've formulated a significant and impactful hypothesis, and it is feasible to pursue in the near future. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. In fact, I think one of the biggest challenges sometimes for students that I see when they're starting out is writing an abstract, right? It's like,
Yeah,
and so I
yeah, very
tell them,
fair.
it's like, so pretty much if you can think in 300 words or so to describe what it is you're trying to achieve and why, which is kind of the idea of an abstract, right? Then you've got something that can be meaningful. If you can't really break it down to that sort of level, then you don't really have it formulated to the point yet that you need.
Definitely. And I think building off of this, and we've touched upon it a little bit here, but we've gone through, we've read the research, we've come up with an idea, we've formed a hypothesis, and now we conduct the experiment. And as I'm sure both of us are aware, whenever you conduct an experiment, you're never going to get exactly to the benchmark that you hoped. But let's say you get preliminary results. They're 50% or 25% or maybe even 10% to the benchmark you imagine. When do you know that these results are good enough, significant and novel enough that they can go from a lab internal preliminary result to potentially something like a publication in the future?
Yeah, and that's a question that, again, I don't think we ever stop asking. And part of it too is there's a great subjectivity to, we always want to think of everything as objective as scientists and engineers, right? We want to think, okay, there's a cut and dry thing. But peer review is a big part of all this. And for now, almost all peer reviews, at least single blind. I mean, I don't know how much of our audience, if they're starting out, understands single blind versus double blind review, but most journals to this day still don't do double blind. And and this impacts a lot of us in a lot of ways. Single blind means that the reviewers know your name, you don't know theirs. And so they know what institution you're from, your name, everything else. And that can lead to a lot of biases. It can, like, if you're a well-known scientist or your warning collaborators are, right, they'll be like, oh, this must be good, right? Sometimes that ends up happening. There's that side of it. Or, there's what's sometimes referred to as the sweatshirt effect. Whereas, like, if it's from MIT or Caltech or whatever, people give it a bigger nod than they might if it's from a lesser known school. But there's also some of the negative things where sometimes people look at the name and be like, well, is this person really whatever? Or they're a junior researcher. I don't know if they know what they're doing yet or whatever. And so now some people say, why don't we always do double blind? Why should the reviewers know it? And there's people who still try to justify not doing double blind, saying, well, it allows you to look for, do you have potential conflict of interest? Looking at, is the stuff they're reviewing or they're citing only their own work and yada, yada, things like this. But I think a lot of that can be handled in an editorial manner. But until everything does go to double blind, that's going to be part of it too. But still, no matter what, at the end of the day, it comes down to those particular peer reviewers, what they think on a given day. And so you can never quite know for sure, but we can do the best we can, right? And so again, I think a lot of it is just based on building up experience of seeing in the past, like what sort of level of advancement has achieved the sort of things you've seen in the publications you've already looked at. And also, it kind of depends on the sort of application on it too. Is this something you're saying you want to have like made in industry, or is it more just of something that is you're trying to do as a proof of principle? So like if you truly have like a new concept and a new methodology, then maybe a proof of principle paper is fine, even if it doesn't quite meet the benchmarks, because you can say, well, then, and sometimes too, you're looking at this, and I won't go too far down the road of patents here, but that's something many of us in science engineering really want to do, right? To get patents. And so, and publications don't, they can actually protect your patent rights for a while as long as you proceed with it. But so if you show proof of principle, that's a big thing there. And then it can be improved later on. But if you're trying to improve something, an existing methodology, yeah, then you have to see that benchmark of is, like you say, is it 20%, is it 50%, is it whatever? And that one, again, it becomes very subjective. It becomes, on any given day, one reviewer might say 20% is fine, another one might say if it hasn't 35%, no, whatever. And so I don't think there's a cut and dry answer to that. I don't know. You may have a much better answer to this than I do, but my experience has always been I get the best results I can from a lab and look at it and say, do I think, and I think as part of it is because in our laboratory settings, it can go either way, right? Sometimes you think, oh, laboratory setting is the ideal case.
Yeah,
So you're
for
not going to
sure.
do better than you can do in a controlled lab. But at the same time, if you've got a laboratory that you've got a very fixed budget on and
Oh,
whatever,
yeah.
and fixed conditions versus some company or something that, especially if it's something that could be an industrial process where they might, have $1 million piece of equipment doing what you're trying to do with, $50,000 worth of equipment, then you can certainly see, well, yeah, if I had that piece of equipment, I could do this X times better. And so then it could be good enough. Just saying, look, with this, we achieved this. So if you had this piece of equipment, it would be, clearly conceivable that it would go to this level, things of that nature. So
Yeah.
always try to think within the limitations of your own experiment or whatever it is you're working on, where you're trying to get to there.
Yeah, for sure. You definitely bring up some good points when it comes to this topic. And I think you're entirely right. Honestly, the best source of feedback you can get is peer review, other experts in the field looking at it and seeing, do I think it's significant? But I think the major danger with that, it'd be great to get your insights with this, is the further you send the results, the less control you have over them. So the best source of feedback you could arguably get is if you sent it to a competitor's lab. The worst thing you can do, though, in academia is send your results to a competitor's lab because then they can reproduce them and especially iterate on them if they're not in a publishable state right now. And I think we all have heard the occasional horror story, and this is not to knock peer review. Everyone should submit the results when they think it's ready, of, a petty reviewing saying no to try to do the research themselves. Happens once in a blue moon, but just as a motivating example. So I think it'll be good to see if you agree with this. What I typically do when I get results is you need to have people of increasingly further scopes that you can show them to see if it passes the sniff test. Like, I agree with this. First one is my lab PI. I get a result, I show it to Lang, I make sure that he agrees it's significant and could be publishable. When I get multiple of those results together and I think it could be a paper, I send it to my old mentor from the lab, my friend Alex. He's an alumni of the lab. He taught me a lot of my foundation optics. I know that he would be brutally honest and tight-lipped about my research and give me that, yes, I would believe this as if it was a paper. Then we start going to close friends, people in the field or out of the field that can think objectively about the research but have less of a stake in me and what I get done. And then only after all of that, I think publication is the next step. Let's send it somewhere to get those peer review insights to see how I can further it. Because I think some of the best feedback I have gotten has been in rejections or conditional acceptances in my papers. Yes, it's almost there, but if you thought of this, but if you asked this question, but if you did this one more experiment, then it would be golden. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you definitely want to have a good network of people that you have available. And certainly when you're a grad student, your immediate mentor, research advisor is your first big go-to, and well, and or other people in your group sometimes. And especially if you're a junior member of the group, some of the senior members, and if there's a postdoc working in your group, that can be a very good resource also, because sometimes your research advisor, you know, depending on your group, they may be really busy or whatever, and and sometimes you don't want to take it to them until you really feel like you've got something.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so having some of these other people there along the way. But yeah, anytime you get mentors, and a mentor network is actually good, because sometimes we use mentor in like the plural or in the singular of like oh, you have one mentor. In reality, as you're going through your career, usually you're going to build up multiple mentors, and you mentioned some others beyond your research advisor and things like that. And so having this network of people that you can talk to, and eventually the idea is you kind of become peers with them, right, as you move along in your career. But still, they're always have this wisdom about them, right, that that they've been doing this longer than you have. And I still have many people like that, even as I'm kind of getting older. I still have people that I look to from when I was a grad student and undergrad, that's been very useful. So yeah, so that network is very useful. I have had one of those horror stories where someone did steal our
Oh,
research,
no.
and we dealt with it so we ended up getting our paper and their paper published side by side in the same journal with
Yeah,
a note at the end of it, to kind of let the audience draw their own conclusions.
got it.
But yeah, so that unfortunately does happen. Um, but yeah, and you mentioned rejections. For people who Rejection is always hard, no matter what type of rejection it is and what you're doing, but you have to be used to that. And especially if you're going into academia in general, because even more so than papers, when you apply for funding to do more research, you're going to get more of those. Um, but you, like you say, you learn a lot from that. You get their feedback. You may not always agree with their feedback. In fact, sometimes you'll get conflicting feedback from two different reviewers on the same paper.
Very
Um,
fair.
but but yeah, it does tend to ultimately make it better, as frustrating as the process can be sometimes. And but yeah, but like you say, you want to be as sure as you can about your research before you get that. Now, at the same time, what I'll also say is it's like shooting for the moon sort of thing. So some people, to avoid rejection, say, "Oh, I'm pretty sure I could get this in X journal," and they just submit it there. But if you really, really want to get it in, let's say it's like Proceedings of IEEE or whatever, you pick your journal that you think is where you want to go, or like Nature or whatever, um, then go for it, right? Because if you're going to get rejection from there, sometimes the feedback you get from there, if you don't get it in there ultimately, resubmit it to a next journal down or something. But you've at least made the shot, and if you get it in that top choice, it's just like applying to grad schools and stuff, right? You have like your schools you really want to get into, and maybe some safety schools. Hopefully, you didn't just apply to your safety schools, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so the same thing with journals. So kind of treat that way. Um, and if you end up dropping down a journal or two, it's not the end of the world. But you got to go for that when you think you've got the result that's ready for publication. You spent the time doing that research, get the best thing out of it you can. So.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a very good point, is the major benefit of submitting to papers, and we're getting a bit ahead. We'll circle back around to the paper thing here in a minute, but I think one of the best benefits of submitting to a journal is you can resubmit. Unlike grad school, you get in where you get in, but you can
Yeah,
always keep going for that Nature, that
yeah,
IEEE proceedings, whatever. And I think the biggest benefit is, yes, it means you have to you have to rewrite the paper if you change the journals, but you get feedback. You then can learn, and this was a very difficult lesson for me to learn, what sets this level journal results from this level journal results, and where do I need to take my research, and what questions do I need to ask to get from here to here in the next paper.
yeah.
But moving on, I think this is a great lead in into our next topic, which is how do we communicate our research successes? So we've gone through, we've gained a foundation, we formed a hypothesis, we've done the experiments, and we've gotten some degree of results. So the major question is now, how can I turn my research results, which is primarily something that your group will understand, into a pitch? And not just that, but a pitch for different audiences. If it's a journal versus a conference versus talking to a friend, what steps can I take to be able to showcase that these results are in fact significant to different audiences?
And so again, I don't know which direction you want to go, but maybe I'll start from the bottom and work up, because
Yeah.
you know, and so like if you're talking to someone who's not, technical at all, or from a completely different field with like not even the same math background or whatever, I always, in fact, because this is where I always tell the students to start anyway. Um, Whatever problem I've got, I always say, if you can't explain it to, and now the example I used to use, and some people may say, oh, this is ageist, sexist, whatever, but it's not meant this way. But I always use my mom as the example, because quite honestly, when I come home from college, she's the person I try to explain research, and she had no technical training, she had no college or anything. And so I'm like, if you can explain it to someone who is of a background that without this, to get them to understand at least the basic idea of what you're doing, then you don't understand it well enough, right? Yet, and you're unable to communicate at all. And so I would do that every single time I'd go home. I would try to summarize to her, and yeah, she probably didn't get everything, but so yeah, like you avoid the specific jargon. And again, one thing with engineers, even more so than most scientists, is love acronyms, right? Um, so don't use all the acronyms, don't use all the mathematical language. Just try to hit the key idea of, I'm trying to have a system where it can do X, and relate that to something that they would see in the real world, whatever this, case when your research may be. And so I think it's a good place to start in general anyway. Even if you're doing it for these other things, start there. Start with this like big picture idea of, can you say, like I was talking about earlier with the abstract, but a real abstract is going to be a little bit more technical. But here it's almost more like the elevator pitch of your research, right? Of, in like a short amount of time with just a few words, not going into details of technical, you just tell someone. And again, this is very useful even in your career, because like within the university, sometimes I'm trying to get, and just recently I got a big chunk of money from the university, not huge, but big enough for what I needed, for some equipment. I had to explain to the administrators why I needed this money. And also I put out a pitch to, actually, we got a few $1,000s from just like donors to the university for this sort of thing. And, if you're trying to get funding from it, because even from the research funding agencies, not all the people you're dealing with are actually from your field. And they're kind of in that next level of a technical person, but not from your direct field sometimes. But so you do have to make these things. And when you're going up, like if you are in academia, if you're going up for promotion, tenure, something like that, you have to again explain your research to people who might be from history or geology or whatever. You need to break it down to a level that they could do without, having all the mathematics of it. So I think it's always a good place to start on that level of just kind of making sure you in your mind have that big picture that you can explain to almost anyone off the street, and they'd say, "Oh, so that's what you're doing, right?" Um, but then that next level, like I say, is explain to someone who's not an expert in your field necessarily, at least your subfield, but maybe they're an engineer, another scientist from chemistry, from whatever, who has, they've got good calc background and differential equations. They know the basics of what, electronics are and things, but they, may not have all this. And so try to find commonality, I think is a big thing there. Think about what they do know, and think about how you can phrase your experiences into what they do. And so I sometimes do collaborate with people from chemistry, and some from some other fields. And so I'll think about the problem from try to look at it from their point of view about what about this can I put into that sort of terminology, to explain. And so, because again, big part of this communication is terminology that we choose. You have to be speaking common language. Just like, if you're speaking to someone in true, like, human languages, right? You need to be able to understand each other. Same thing here. Um, Half the way we speak in engineering and science is not the way everyone speaks. And so we want to make sure we're understood. You don't sound smart by throwing out words that other people don't understand. You actually make yourself just seem arrogant or clueless sometimes, right? But then if you're talking to someone who is within your, field, and it either could be a collaborator, sometimes it could be a mentor, it could be whatever, and you're trying to, like you were talking about earlier, about reaching out to them and saying, well, what do you think about this research? Do you see any problem with it or whatever? Then you can really dig into the details. You can use some of the mathematics, you can use some of that jargon, and that's fine at that point. But again, you're trying to pick out that key idea. Like, what is, again, like I always come back to the abstract. It's, describe for them, because these people are going to be busy too, right? So now if they've got time to read your whole paper or something you've written up, that's great. But, in a few sentences, can you tell them what the idea is you're trying to do, what it is you're trying to do, or what you think you've achieved, and kind of try to get their feedback in whatever sense it is you're doing with them, and whatever. Because again, also, I guess with this too, communication should always have a purpose, right? Now, of course, there's small talk, as we always mention, right? But even small talk usually has some purpose. But yeah, if you're doing communication about your research, usually there's a reason why you're communicating, right? And so always have that in the back of your mind too, is what is your goal of talking to this person about your research? Is it to get funding? Is it to get exposure of the research? Is it to get feedback on the ideas, or to get a new idea, or whatever it may be, or to build a new collaboration? Because that's sometimes a goal too, right? So having all these things in mind, but again, always keeping it short, finding the right language, and understanding your reason for talking to the person. I think if you have those three things in mind at whatever level you're doing, I think that, in my mind at least, is kind of the key to that sort of communication.
Yeah, for sure. And you bring up a lot of good points when it comes to that. I think one thing that you mentioned that I definitely want to follow up on is how do you build up your story to be able to get to the point that you can actually talk to anyone? Because as a technical professional, you're going to have to talk to grant proposal committees, non-technical managers, your own family about what you have to do. And you need to make sure that everyone across the board can understand it. So usually when I go about turning my research into a pitch, I first start super high up. How would I describe it to a lab mate? So, for example, for my research, I could say to a lab mate, okay, I use the concepts of end-to-end deep learning to optimize diffractive optics for deployments in a miniscope. Then I go through, I look at that statement, and I underline the domain-specific words. Well, people might not know end-to-end. People might not know deep learning. People might not know diffractive optics or miniscope. So then we need to exchange them with how to explain those terms that someone can understand. So it's easier to then say, okay, I use a combination of optics and algorithms to optimize custom lenses that go into miniaturized devices that manipulate the wave nature of light so I can focus light better in complex media such as the brain. I then shrink that all down into a form factor about this big so I can attach these custom platforms on tiny animals such as mice to be able to monitor their real-time neural or brain activity. And all of a sudden, you've broken down the concepts in a way that's a bit more understandable. So when it comes to that, in your way of thinking about scientific communication, how can you identify that scientific jargon and how can you start phasing that out of your typical conversation to have more generalizable statements?
Yeah, well, like I say, part of it's always first I look for acronyms, right? And they have to go, right? And we use them so often, and it's really hard to break ourselves sometimes of that. I also think about, okay, what terms are kind of mathematical in their nature. Now, and again, depending on who you're talking to, some of those things you can keep, right? So it depends again on where in that communication level you're going to, but some of that you have to remove, or at least put it into terminology that they could understand. Um, and and then really think about, you know, just are these words something that, and again, I have to look back a lot farther, but since I talk to undergrads every day, that's useful for me. But for, if you're grad research or something, think back, like, would I have understood this when I was an undergrad even? Did I have that knowledge then? Because it kind of sneaks up on you sometimes too, right? The words you understand, the things, it's almost like, oh, I always understood that, right? But no, it hasn't been that long ago that you learned some of these things. So yeah, so just really trying to identify that. But again, like I say, you don't need to take it all out depending on the level of your audience. And so, because you also don't want to talk down to an audience, right? And that's a tricky thing too. Is so, like, if you're talking to somebody from another field, um, you want to make sure that you kind of have the right level, because you don't want to be explaining something to them that they're like, why are they trying to explain that to me when I'm an expert in whatever? And so, try to know your audience to the level that you break it down. So you take out, like, if you're speaking to like a PhD in another field, um, especially if it's a mathematically related field at all, or some scientific field, you don't necessarily have to break down the math sometimes, but you may at least have to define your terms, especially if your terms are very specific to your field, or use more general language, or spend 20 minutes or whatever Googling how do they say this term. Because there's certain terms that, like in engineering, electrical engineering, we use the term convolution a lot. Okay. And I even found out when I switched into physics, yeah, some physicists understood what I meant by that, but they actually use different terminology for the same idea. And so it took me a while to get used to the fact that, oh, if I'm speaking to this audience, I better use this term. But if I'm going to speak to engineers, I can use, and so for the exact same idea, the exact same operation, people, both sides use it and they understand it, but they don't use the same term for it. And so we can sometimes actually spend the time saying, well, if I'm talking to a chemist, do they use this term? How do they describe it? What would they say, or whatever? So
I really appreciate that. I think you might appreciate this also coming from optics. It took me forever to learn that different fields of optics referred to angle space versus K space versus spatial frequency as the exact same thing, but different symbols, different math, different
yeah.
assumptions in each one of them. Blew my mind when I was like a fourth year and it all finally clicked together. But no, that is a very, very important point. And I think we kind of jumped ahead a little bit to talk about how to formulate your research as a pitch. I think one key step I want to ask here before moving on to our last topic is how do we go about formulating the story? Not just the pitch, but how I explain my research and prepare it for, say, a publication, a research presentation, or a more detailed conversation with a friend. How do I boil down what I did into something comprehensive and appreciable for a long conversation format?
Yeah. So for that, and for most of the research I've ever done, I usually start with presentations, like, shooting at a conference before the publication comes out. Now, sometimes I'm writing them simultaneously because, again, and without going into that whole danger we were talking about earlier, again, about people stealing the research, but there's always that sort of thing. But I always like to think in terms of a presentation first, at least for me, and laying it out like slide by slide. And because in that sense, because again, for most of us, I think even when we're reading papers, once we've read the abstract and the title abstract, I like to jump to the figures, right? And before I read the whole thing, and I look at those, and so because graphics in these things really tell a lot of the story, and so I spend a lot of time trying to look at make the graphics, think how to best present the data, whatever it is. Of course, there's also the diagrams, right? So like you've got some diagram of the work, you've got the some sort of data that you're trying to present. All those things, they say picture worth 1,000 words. I think that's easily true here, right? So I do that part of the story first, lay out all my pictures, and then, think of it in like the presentation, sort of a talk format where it's like, okay, now let me give like 2 or 3, bullet points for each diagram. In fact, usually when I'm giving a talk for something at a conference or something, I try not to have almost any slide that doesn't have at least some sort of graphic on it. Because I think if it's just a whole bunch of bullet pointed text or something or equations, it can be a little much unless I'm showing code. But even then, I like try to diagram what the code is doing or something. But yeah, so I start the story that way. I write out, even if I'm going to get a paper written up right away, I still try to kind of diagram it out as I would give as a talk. And then I start putting the sections of the talk together or the paper together, into actual text format and actually filling in the text, because a lot of filling in the text ends up being like referring to what's been done before and things like that, calling in, because that's the thing, you have to cite all the previous works and whatever. And so that the whole introduction section, that's usually one of the last ones I actually write. In fact, the last 2 sections I always write are the introduction section where you're giving all the previous works, though I've better have read them before I get to that point, otherwise something bad's gonna happen. And then the conclusions, right? You summarize at the very, very end. But I go through and I lay out the experimental methodologies and the results and the analysis and things like that. But I like to say I start that really from like this pictorial standpoint of this is what the work looked like to my mind, and here's some keywords, and then just filling in the English of it and typing it out. I think kind of flows once you've got that laid out, so that because you really do have your story laid out at that point.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a really good point. I think especially for long-term format like a conversation or especially a presentation, you really got to start from that high up objective level. And really what I try to encourage some of my mentees to do is, start broad, start with again the what, the why, and then what people typically care about the least in these formats, because they don't tend to be domain experts with you, is the how. So you can underplay that a little bit, but definitely play up the results you got out of it. So what is the field I'm engaging with? What is the major question I'm trying to answer? Why is it important? Okay, now here's how we go to do it with the pretty results. And I love the idea of doing it pictorially. I think, like, especially in research, a picture is worth 1,000 words. If you can summarize 10 equations in one picture, you're going to keep so much more audience engagement. And one of the useful tools I found when I'm completely lost how to tell a story is I make my slides, and kind of as you were saying, I write out in a complimentary Word doc what's the 2 or 3 major bullet points or messages for each slide. And if I read that document and I get lost or confused from those bullet points, then something's either missing or in the wrong order or not emphasized properly enough. But once either the pictures or the bullet points make sense independently, then I think you have a great backbone to build your presentation off of. And when in doubt, I think the best test is, depending on the level of technical details you want in your presentation, ask one of your PhD friends in a different lab, like, okay, you know what my core concepts are, or no, you're from a completely different field, but can think objectively about science. Let's sit down and talk about it and see if you at least get the core message I'm trying to say. Do you agree? Is that typically a good strategy, or what do you tend to do when you're lost in developing a presentation?
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree. And like, we're talking about reaching out to people and stuff too. I sometimes think sending them, because, if you're to the point of writing up a whole paper, sure, that's one thing if you want to look through a draft, but often, I'll send them like 2 or 3 slides and
Yeah,
say, well, this is kind of what I've done. This is kind of where I'm at. What do you think about this? Right. Or I'm stuck at this point, or this didn't turn out the way I thought it should. Do you have thoughts? But yeah, if you give it to them where they can see, like, here's a picture of what you say you did, here's a picture of your results, right? And then you discuss, I think that's really, I think many of us kind of are visual in that sense, right? And we like to see these sort of things. So the words are important, like we talked about that earlier, picking the right words, but that can just be a few words if you have the picture for them to look at, because words can also be imprecise if we're not careful, right? And it's hard sometimes to describe, like,
definitely.
when you were saying earlier about what you're doing with the research, so in my mind, I was sitting there trying to form a picture of it, right? And you
Yeah.
even use, like, you're saying, well, it's about this big and whatever. And so So really having that sort of thing, so you can look at it and say, wait a second, this isn't quite how I had that picture or whatever, or what if you did this differently? Or when you get this result drawn here, why does the curve do this? Or why do you say this is the, whatever? And so once you're looking at it, I think it's so much easier to relate the ideas. Um, and even for yourself, sometimes when you're looking at your data, you're like, wait a second, this data, and even come back to the very beginning of what we're talking about, well, how do you know if it's significant or whatever? Sometimes when you start looking at the curve, especially because hopefully whether some error bars or some sort of fitting or whatever it is you're using to kind of process
I
the
get you.
raw data
Yeah.
into an interpretive data, um, when you look at that curve, I think that's sometimes the best thing, right? Is you're looking at it's like, well, does this really tell the story
Hmm.
that I was trying to tell, right? Because that's the thing. At the end of the day, you like say the why and whatever. It really is a story we're trying to tell about the results we got, um, and that they're meaningful, right? And that usually can be done in like one graphic. Like, boom, here's the key result.
Yep.
And if that graphic doesn't look impressive to ourselves, it's probably not going to look impressive to anybody else either, because we spent the time making this thing and we're so proud of it. So,
Very fair. And I think to tie it back to an earlier lesson when we were talking about at first how to get started, one thing to keep in mind is communication, like everything else, is a skill to build during a PhD or graduate student degree. So take all the opportunities, especially in low risk environments, to give a presentation. I would much rather go and bother my mentor and give him my presentation and him tell me, Joe, I'm absolutely lost and I know your research, than have it be when I'm at the conference. And that actually did happen. My first conference, my presentation went through 5 or 6 different iterations with different people just to learn the key basics of storytelling. And definitely each time I failed at that task, or each time that I confused my test audience, it gave me core lessons that I learned and incorporated to be a better storyteller.
absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, they always, engineers and scientists are, expected to be bad communicators.
Yeah.
Um, and so when we can communicate our ideas,
Oh yeah, for
we're dealing,
sure.
especially with dealing with non-technical people, whether they're in funding agencies or whatever, they love that, right?
Oh yeah. Then you're going
If
to
you're working in
definitely
the
get
industry or
ahead.
something, yeah. So
Yeah, and I agree with that. If you ever want to kickstart your career, be a good storyteller. Definitely make sure you can sell what you're doing with pride. But I think just to get to our last topic here before jumping into Q&As, this is to briefly touch upon a topic we'll discuss in our next Grad Lab episode, but we've gone through the entire pipeline. We've learned the field, we've built the foundation, we've got the hypothesis, we got the results, we know how we want to communicate it. Now the next major question is, okay, where do we send it? And I think the major question there that we have to ask is this a conference paper where I give a presentation? Is this a poster session paper, or is this a journal paper? And while, some come with their own associations of what's better for your career, there's benefits to doing all of these. So from a high up objective perspective, when might you want to do a conference? When might you want to do a poster? When might you want to do a journal with a specific set of results?
and I think with that, because there's a question in the Q&A that I'll kind of go ahead and tie into this a little bit,
Yeah.
which is it healthy for us to associate the quality of our results to a specific target publication? Because also sometimes think about, sometimes people have this misconception that a conference isn't as good as a
Hmm.
journal or whatever. Now, again, usually you do hope that your conference publications or conference presentations will lead to a journal publication, though it's not always the full intent. Sometimes you're putting out like a preliminary idea to kind of see where it's going to go or something like that. Um, and so, like I say, as much as possible, I always like um, to go through the conference step, not always, but usually, because it's, and usually it's when it's at a pretty solid but not completely done stage, is the way I look at it. Because I'm out there, I throw out some ideas, because part of a conference, if you get the right audience, is you're going to see collaborators, right? Maybe not immediate collaborators, but people people you've worked with in the past, or people in a similar field who hopefully some of them you trust. And that's the thing too, picking the right conference becomes an art too, right? But so if you go to certain conferences enough, it is part of your community. And they know you, you know them. And so the whole idea of conferences originally was really to get collaborations going and to get connections, because you know it's now in the virtual world, it's sometimes a little easier to talk to a whole bunch of people all over, but I mean this really draws, for some of these, hundreds to thousands of people, sometimes 10,000 or more people at some of these bigger conferences together who have similar interests, similar backgrounds, and similar things they're researching. And so you give a talk or give a poster even, and the best part of it to me is the questions that you get. Because it's one thing, like say, so we've already talked about reaching out before you even get to the stage to people well, but this draws in experts across the field. And now sometimes their questions are very simple or sometimes you can tell they're a competitor who's just trying to tear your research apart, whatever. But many of the questions you get are actually very good questions that you may not have thought of yet. And it may trigger a thought in you that'll help your research get to that next level that you hadn't quite reached yet. And so, and of course, you always get those, well, this is more of a comment than a question thing too. But sometimes those are useful, rarely, but sometimes. And so I think that conferences are great for really developing your next idea. And so I try to do it when I'm pretty far along in one research project, but kind of ready to play off, okay, where am I taking this next? And then a publication, of course, is when I have a result I think is good enough that this one's ready to put out there. And so I try to do it kind of this flow thing. Unfortunately, over the last several years, and it kind of started with when I talk about taking the break from academia, and then I had pandemic not long after that. So I've kind of got broken from this flow for a little bit. I'm starting to hopefully get back into it again now. But that's kind of how I see it, is you get along far enough, and simultaneously, before you actually go to present, I try to get the paper written up and ready to submit before I'm actually going to make the presentation. But usually conference submissions are far enough in advance. Now, again, it varies too, because some conferences have published proceedings. And so that's different too. And so it depends on the type of conference you're going to. There's all sorts of things to look at there. And one thing, I'll just flash this up on the screen for, if you don't mind me sharing one more thing on the screen here.
Go for it.
Hopefully I see it easily here. Too many windows open, so I'm going to have to do the whole share all, look at all screens to find which window it is. Oh, here it is. I think I've got the right one, hopefully. Because one thing to think about, and this, like I say, ties back into the question that was in the Q&A, is what is the quality of different journals? And again, sometimes your mentor or you will already have a favorite journal. But so here I just pulled up from IEEE site. And again, there's different ways that we rate these. And again, IEEE, very proudly tells you which of theirs, so like out of in electronics and electrical engineering journals, 15 of the top 20 in impact factor are IEEE journals and so forth. But you can see where they all land or whatever. And then they go through a bunch of subfields and all these different things. And even things like civil engineering, biomedical engineering, IEEE has journals for. And of course, all these other areas do too. And so part of it is, again, deciding which. And so as far as like, should you think about the quality of your research in terms of which journal you submit to or which conference or whatever, let's say maybe yes and no. Because again, like I say, the sweatshirt or thing I mentioned earlier is part of it too, right? Certain people and certain universities are going to be more likely to get published in Nature or whatever than others. And it's not a reflection on you or your research necessarily. And there is, like I say, there's a lot of flaws with the peer review process, but it's still the best thing we have right now, right?
Yeah.
And so you can't, but still when I'm looking at it, yes, there's certain things that I look at when I'm doing my research, like, well, this is good. I think I did quality, solid research, but it's not something that's so, because part of it too is breadth, right, of impact. So it's like, this is going to impact a very small fraction of the world, even of this field. So it's going to go to this very, very specific journal. It may not have and because part of the reason these things have the impact factor they do is how broad they are too, right?
For sure.
So like everyone looks at this one. This is only from this very small. So of course there's not going to be tons and tons of references from this because it's a very small sub area. But if I think, well, this thing here could actually have impact across several subfields, then I'm going to shoot for this bigger journal or things like that. So it's not so much the quality, I don't think, sometimes when we're looking at the journals we're applying for, it's how many people are going to care, which is not the same thing as quality, right? So it's, and again, because like when you look at the highest selling cars in the world, they're not necessarily what we call always the best cars in the world, right? It could be from cost, it could be from whatever. But so same thing with our research is, if you really think it's going to be impactful to a lot of fields, you maybe shoot for that higher thing. Or if you get a bigger benchmark than you expected or something, that's great too. But in some way, it needs to be very impactful to shoot for some of those top journals. But again, shooting for like a good solid journal in your area, there's nothing at all wrong with that.
Oh yeah.
You shouldn't look at that as a negative. Now, there are bad journals, but that's a whole nother story.
And I think you bring up two very important follow-ups here. First, to dial back a little bit onto conferences and posters in particular, I definitely think that there's a little bit of a culture in academia, and especially in grad students, like, oh, it's just a conference paper. Oh, it's just a conference poster. But I think what you might not get in impact factor and sellability, you get in the ability to test your communication skills and honestly, networking. I think one of the greatest realizations I had as a grad student is the people surrounding me, they're the engineering leaders, they're the technical founders of tomorrow. So whenever I go to a conference, yeah, sure, I might have my 15 minutes of fame there as I give my presentation, get two questions, walk out the door, and that's kind of it. But every day there, I tell myself, I'm going to add 5 people on LinkedIn. I'm going to introduce myself to 3 other speakers. I'm going to ask 2 more questions just to make sure I'm getting my face out there. I'm meeting and networking with people and I'm building that community. Because as you said, you never know who's going to be your coworker, collaborator, recommender of the future based off of these interactions. And especially dialing it back to our communication point we had a little while ago, you can get so far as a technical professional if you know how to tell a story. So getting all the practice you can, telling your stories to different audiences and learning how to tailor your points to a target audience is a huge and widely beneficial skill. And then I think the second point that we brought up there about journal. Yeah, definitely. You really hit the nail on the head. There's a bit of a balance when it comes to publishing versus audience and impact factor. Yes, it would be great if every publication you get gets into Nature, but if you put it in Nature and nobody cites it, then really did it make an impact? And sometimes it is better to think about the scope of your project and understand this specific community will talk about it, will embrace it, will appreciate it. So I should start choosing to publish in these venues. So when it comes to you, for example, let's say in your domain, at what point do you really start making a decision of this should be a conference versus a journal versus a high impact journal with my results?
Yeah. And so, and unlike some of the IEEE conference proceeding conferences, a lot of the conferences I go to don't do the full paper format. It's just, you give your talk or you give your post or whatever. And so, like say, for most of my research, I do tend to hit the conferences along the way with the plans. But usually, like say, when I'm doing that, I try to have, unless I'm really in a preliminary stage, I try to have the paper kind of ready to get into the submission cycle. Just because burnt, too many times on um, that, because that's the thing too at conferences. Conference is we talk about, it can be a great thing to stimulate new ideas for you, but you got to make sure that it's a new idea for you that's stimulated from somebody's talk or poster, and not you're just trying to do what they've got on their talk or poster, which also does happen. Um, but yeah, so, and I think absolutely the exposure you get, especially in your career by going to conferences, is huge. So it's not something people should look at as a bad thing. It's a great growth thing. It really gets you out there, gets you a lot of ideas. And especially if it is one with a published proceedings, then that's still a very, that can actually be a good exposure too. And it's almost at the level of a publication at that point. But still having a bunch of conference presentations still is good. And it gives you connections that can lead to better publications. It can make your publications, and often at these two, there will be the publishers there of many of the journals, and sometimes we'll even have Q&As with them, and so you can go and talk to them and learn more. So if you're starting out, that's not a bad thing to do, is go to some of them. Sometimes they even hold like little receptions to where you can go and talk to the editors of whatever journals that are related to that field, and find out what they're saying about what they expect and what sort of things. But yeah, at the end of the day, if you're going to be in academia, the reality is you do need journal publications. And so finding just the right ones, picking it out. And again, it's that whole, the perish or publish thing gets problematic, but there is that balance of quantity versus quality, I always think. And so don't rush it to, and that's, so we talked about earlier about, well, sometimes you step down a journal or you go to a different journal. That's fine to a point. But if you're consistently having to do that with some of the work, maybe, it wasn't really ready, right? And you needed to get a little bit better, because, and there are, and quite honestly, people get reputations for this also. I've known, certain researchers who everybody knows that they basically take the same thing, alter it very, very slightly, and try to publish it in 3 or 4 different journals just to get more publications. And, people end up seeing through that. So I'd say try to get good quality results, get your final results in your journals. But again, but it does become a little tricky too, because like if you really got something really, really big, is it too probably, so you start playing those games in your mind and you're like, well, what should I do with this? Could it be two things or whatever? Um, but yeah, it's always walking that fine line, but I still think usually at the end of the day, some really, really good um, journal publications are something you can be proud of, and it can really take you a long way. Whereas, yeah, if you got 10, 20, 30, whatever, as you're building up numbers and some of these people, hundreds, ultimately, yes, that's great. But yeah, look at even how much were they cited, and that's what reason I always get so excited. I occasionally will go to Google Scholar, and for some of my articles that I'm really, really proud of when I wrote them, I almost cry because like, wow, in the last 20 years that thing's got like 5 citations or something. It's like no one cared, right? But I do like it when people actually care about the research, and citations are really a part of how you see if people cared. Now again, that sometimes is a reflection of where it got published too, right? And so the more visibility, whatever. But if you're publishing it in some journal that the people in the subfield look at least, hopefully the people in the subfield will care and will cite it. Again, you can't, like anything else, like people's comments online about whatever, you can't put your own self-esteem too much into these sorts of things. But it is sometimes like, the articles like your baby that you put out there in the world, and you want people to think it's of value and cite it. But yeah, you can only do so much. But yeah, so I certainly think conferences are something you should continue to do throughout your career. Never look at it as a secondary thing. It's not a replacement for journals, but it is, I think, an integral part of what you need to be doing to, like you say, to network, to get new ideas, to somewhat just get out in the world and talk to different people. Like if you're at a big institution, sure, there may be a lot of people, but still it's the same people that you see all the time. So go see this different network of people and get out there. But then ultimately, the ultimate goal for, I think, all of your research, if it really reaches the benchmarks you're really hoping for, then it ultimately should go to a journal. But along the way, or if you have research that didn't quite achieve what you were thinking, if you don't think it's quite ever going to get there, it just didn't fully work out, it's still often good enough to go to the conference and say, well, this is what we did. And maybe then through some conversations, you'll get the idea to like say, oh, now I can go back and do something different that will get to where I was trying to get to.
Yeah,
So there's
for
a lot of
sure.
different ways to do them.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions I had for now. I'll take a moment here and open it up to our audience. Does anyone have any other questions for Sean? At this point, definitely feel free to turn on your video and unmute to join the conversation, or put your questions in the Q&A chat below. And building off of that, Aileen, did we answer your question sufficiently?
Hello, everybody.
So
My voice is a little down. Sorry. Yes. You did answer my question. I did have a follow-up question though. So quite often as a senior researcher, you probably know the proceedings of how to look at results. But as a junior researcher, we might or might not have the capacity to understand how to present our data and make a meaningful impact out of our data. What do you advise us on that?
yeah, and so I think one big thing I would say, and I'm happy to hear what both you say on this as well, but is try to present it in first as honest a manner as possible. Because I think sometimes people, because we want our data, we have a certain story we're trying to tell, right? Sometimes we almost force it a little too much, and that's problematic too. Because if we didn't achieve the story we're trying to tell, then that's something we got to figure out why. But try to, as much as possible, make the graphic very clear and make it where you're showing very definitely what sort of analysis you're doing to the data. So like if you're doing some sort of regression, some sort of fit, whatever, making it such that the audience can see exactly what it is saying, what the data is saying and what the data maybe isn't saying as well, I think is important. Making, not playing with the axes too much to, so if it shouldn't, it should be something that you'd think about independently. Like if you were looking at this, if this would have been in a paper that someone else wrote, would this convince you that, wow, this is a great thing? And so you have to give some sort of issue of, because in some way, shape, or form, it needs to represent the raw data, but also there usually needs to be some sort of a fitting or an error analysis or something on there that really kind of tells what is the, so is there a curve that goes along with it? Is it whatever? And if at all possible, is there a theoretical fit to the thing, or is there like limitations, like, you know, or this is, or show curves from, and this is the thing too, and you can usually easily get permission to do this sort of thing, but like if there's been previous curves from something that people have done before or previous data, show that as, you know, another part of the curve, so you can really show directly some way to differentiate where you are, what benchmark you reach versus what the, you know, has been done or what was there before. Because like I say, usually that graphic, like I say, quite honestly, and maybe it's a little bit because I get lazy when I'm looking at too many papers, but actually the first thing I look at is the title graph, maybe then the abstract, but then I go to those figures. And usually the figure that's supposed to show me the ultimate conclusion of the data is the one I focus on the most. And I look at that, and it's like, what is this, what story is this picture telling? And so this thing, it really has to be able to kind of, you in your mind, I think, know what you want your research to show, right? And so it's just a question of then saying, does this graphic, like if I just went to a room of people that kind of know my field, put this graphic up on the board as it is with the proper labeling or whatever, would they have a rough idea of what that story was achieved? That's kind of the way I always go with it. But yeah, it's choosing, you know, because, and again, the danger, you know, with fits and whatever is, again, try to be honest with yourself on what's meaningful there too, right? Because if you use enough parameters for a fit, you can make anything fit, you know, occur,
Very
right?
fair.
So, but yeah, it's just choosing, you know, keep it to what's, again, like I say, that's, I guess, part of the, you know, because there's ways, you know, yeah, there's people completely fudge data, and I don't think any of us would do that, hopefully, and whatever. But there's that in between world, right, where you're like, well, I think it should look like this, so let me use this parameter, you know, just try to keep it as simple and as clean as possible. Let it really speak for itself, but at the same time, make sure it's speaking, right?
Yeah.
If that graphic doesn't really tell a story, then it's not doing you or anyone any favors.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up on that point briefly, I think you really hit the nail on the head. When you're presenting a result, you don't want to undersell it because you do yourself a discredit, but you don't want to oversell it because then you do the field a discredit.
Yeah.
And I definitely think when I go about presenting a result to make sure it's reasonable, I think of three things: the scope, the impact, and sanity checks. The scope is, what am I doing and why? Like, what does this experiment mean in the context of the paper, in the context of the overarching field? The impact is, how was it significant? Like, how did it actually showcase a hypothesis? How did it push the state of the art? Or how did it reinforce core concepts that were previously arbitrary? And the last bit is the sanity check. And we talked about this, the best point earlier. It's hard to learn scientific communication just upfront and by yourself. The best thing you can do is try and try and try and try. So if you have a figure, if you think it's good, the best thing to do is send it to a lab mate, send it to your PI, send it to a mentor that you appreciate and respect in the field, and ask, does this sell the message? This is what I'm trying to show. Can you tell me what the impact is just from this figure right here? And I think Sean brings up a really good point that, yeah, you might write out your entire idea, hypothesis, and how this is impactful on the paper, but people really just look for the pretty figures. So gaining the skills of figure making and digesting big conclusions into digestible visual pieces of media is very, very imperative for effective storytelling and effective research sharing as well.
And just one small thing with this too, and this is always a tricky kind of balance, I think sometimes comes from confidence we have sometimes, is the results are what they are, right? But the interpretation of the results is, I think, sometimes what makes or breaks the paper. And so I think we need to be as brave as we can on saying, well, I showed this, up to the point of where our confidence will let us, right? And so, because sometimes I think people hold back too much. And I've actually known people who have done work that actually showed something, and then someone else ended up getting the credit because the first person wasn't willing to claim that they actually showed that yet. So be as brave as you can up to the point that you think is within your confidence level of what you did.
The reason I kind of asked this question is because there is a high possibility, the trend that I am actually kind of observing right now in the scientific community is reproducibility. Your citations are only going to increase if your data is reproducible by the other team and then continued forward. And I kind of, in my research work, the impedance that I had was probably with that. So, you know, I guess what I'm trying to point out to is the representation of the data is not as important as your message that you are trying to convey, unless you are conveying, like you said, the absolute truth. So.
And again, back, if you go way back, peer review used to be where they would actually ask the peer reviewer to try to reproduce the results. That's long since gone. And so the sad truth is certain things that aren't reproducible that, actually make it through peer review, because it seems kind of feasible if someone's reading it. And so, yeah, it is a tricky thing. And then I've personally actually run into that sort of case where I've trying to reproduce what someone else has done to go to the next step, and it just wasn't possible. So yeah, so that is a tough one, and I don't know really if there's any good solution to that, because as peer reviewers, we, and I think most of the time now, yes, there's been well-documented cases of people just putting through data that wasn't real. But for the most part, I think it's usually conditions in the lab sometimes, whether it's noise or whatever ends up happening on a particular data set, you'll get a run that looks like whatever. Reproducibility is always a big problem, and hopefully it's something that we're working to be better about. But yeah, and so I think it's also by being very clear about what your data represents. So like, was it integrated over time, or what sort of things did you do, or did you do multiple trials, or really showing. And that's the reason, like, say, statistics of the data I think is important. So rather than just, sometimes people just put a curve. Where did this curve come from? And is there some sort of like confidence level on the curve and all these sorts of things? I think the more information we give, the better. Again, sometimes people are always worried if I say too much, someone's going to come in and steal the next thing I'm going to do. But at the same time, I think as a community, we have to be a little open. So if someone really, really has a good confidence level in small error bars, however they're representing it on their data line and data fit, it makes a difference over someone who's got error bars so big that anything could have passed through there, right? So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think you're entirely right, Aileen. I think one of the major limitations right now with the academic review cycle is we don't have the bandwidth to reproduce and check every claim. And while that does present an innate danger, I think the best thing we can do as researchers to start from the ground up is make sure you're not hiding details and you're not taking, we'll say, extraordinary cases as the main message of your paper. So like, for example, if you had to run an experiment 100 times and it worked once, you can't say that one time is now representative of the hundreds of trials. And unfortunately, people do this in the past, but I think kind of the beauty that we end up with and what Sean's talking a lot about is if you have an extraordinary case like that, like it worked once, that's all of a sudden a new scientific question. Now, how can I change how I'm thinking about and conducting my experiment to make this more reproducible? And it doesn't need to be 100 times, but my gosh, it better be more than 50 if you want to treat it as the average case for your experiment. I think a good example of this is I engage a lot with the field of deep learning, and I think there's always the risk to put 100 different instances of your model onto a supercomputer cloud, run it, and hope that one of them learns through the random weights the correct behavior you're looking for. Okay, well, what happened the other 99 times? How can we now think objectively of how we're tackling the problem to improve the quality? So I think it's not a great answer right now, but I think the best thing that you can do, we can do, and our audience can do right now is build it into your pipeline. Make sure every result you get is something you can do twice. And if you can't do it twice, ask the question of why and make that prevalent in your paper.
I did have a question though.
Go for it.
Do we have time? Perfect. So unlike most of the researchers, there are, I think, a set of researchers who have a hypothesis, and especially it happened for me. I'm working with a couple of deep learning models kind of in a pipeline. And when I presented my hypothesis to my research team, they asked me a lot of questions, but they all gave me a thumbs up. And what happens is that researchers are always, I think, eternally self-critical. So we seek out feedback in a meaningful way. So what do you have for researchers who have all thumbs up from their PI, from their team members and everybody else, and they are just doubting themselves whether it's too good to publish?
Yeah, that's if everyone around you, and if they've really looked at it critically enough, and you know, then and you actually have the confidence to think that it's correct, then I think you just have to go for it and see what the peer reviewers say, because then the peer reviewers are going to be, you know, completely like removed from your immediate group, and maybe they'll have feedback. And again, peer review is truly a roll of the dice for good and bad. I like peer reviewers who are critical but fair, and it's a tricky thing to get. You get some just hardly look at it at all, and you get others who are just trying to find fault. But there's that good middle ground, and when you get those, you'll get that feedback, and so maybe they'll find something that no one around you saw, or maybe they'll just agree that other than just these small changes here or there, this really is good work. Because I think we all do kind of doubt ourselves sometimes, especially if the result seems better than we even expected. Why is it so good? And hopefully that happens to all of us at least once in our careers. But yeah, it is tough to and if sometimes you think it's okay, that everyone around you says it's okay, and it gets published in 5-10 years or even a year, whatever, down the road, you end up seeing that there's actually something that was slightly wrong with that. If you went into it, in my mind, with complete honesty, there's nothing wrong. We all can make mistakes, and ultimately then it wasn't just your mistake, right? It was a whole bunch of people's mistakes, that no one caught that until later. And that does happen. Hopefully that's not the case, but it can happen, and there's nothing to ever be ashamed of from that. As long as you went into it completely honest and you showed everybody everything there. At least that's my view on it. In fact, that's the whole point of science engineering, right? Is constantly we're going back through and finding things that weren't, whether it was completely wrong or it just needed updated or whatever, and making that incremental changes. But I think we can all learn from that. And even some of the things I've learned the most from actually have been papers where I wasn't able to reproduce it, because it's like, wait, what I saw was this, not what they said at all. And then it took me down a whole new route. Why did I see this, and so forth? So it can actually stimulate new thoughts and whatever. So yeah, so certainly I think people who are just careless and throw things out there, that's one thing. Or people who just intentionally mislead, that's a completely new. There's all these different levels. But if you really, have looked at it, you don't see any direct errors in it, everyone around you says it's fine, and then it goes through peer review, then I think if there happens to have been something wrong, that will happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a really good question. And I think only once in my PhD did I actually have an experiment go right the first time that I tried it. And it felt wrong. I was like, what the heck is going on? What did I miss? This couldn't have worked first time. And I think in those situations, the best thing, much as we were talking about, that we can do is try it again. See if it's reproducible or slightly perturb the conditions. Like, especially as something computational or deep learning based, okay, well, let's retrain it on different randomly initialized weights and make sure that it follows the same trend. Or, okay, let's do perturbation analysis to make sure I don't have shortcut learning going on. Or let me feed it something out of distribution, but representative of the real world case, and see if it just completely blows up. And guess what? If it passes all those sanity checks and it still worked the first time, well, then you just got a really good result and you should be proud of it. And definitely one thing about research is it is iterative. We can't use the knowledge of tomorrow to assess the results of today. So if you get something that is correct and objectively true and makes it past peer review right now, but it proves to be, we won't say incorrect, but comes with caveats in the future, then you can learn from that. And guess what? That's another follow-up paper right there. Gives you a whole new avenue to address all of the things that did not go right last time that you can then build upon. So I think the best thing you can do is be transparent about your successes, be transparent about your mistakes, and be transparent about what you've learned through the process.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for this opportunity. Hopefully it was useful for some people, but it was a great pleasure to speak to you.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you, Sean, and thank you, Elaine, for joining us. It was a great conversation with you both. And thank you to our audience for watching this episode of Grad Lab. Keep your eye out. We're going to have many more coming throughout the year with many of great guests, just like Sean here. Well, thanks again, and have a good day. Bye now.